Great. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Budgeting Basics. This particular program is made possible through the National Endowment for the Arts through their funding of this organization. Also made possible by the state arts agencies, who are also members of South Arts. My name is Jessica Holland, and joining me is Emmett Stevenson. We'll also have a couple of other South Arts folks join in and out who will be helping with the presentation as we move along. And so we'll welcome as they join. Real quick, on this first slide, you'll see my name and also my email address. If you have any follow-up questions that you would like to ask, please let me know. I do work with South Arts, but I am facilitating this particular session today, which is kind of unusual because we usually have guests host this for us. Before we begin, I wanted to do my little disclaimer here. Oh, I don't think it actually saved on there, but I will just mention that though I have a lot of experience in the arts, I've been working in this field for over 20 years, both as a practitioner and as an arts administrator. I'm not a CPA. So I may sometimes sound like one, but I'm not a CPA and I'm not an attorney. So if you have very specific questions about your particular situation or business, please consult a professional. Believe me, that'll be the best course. So as we go through this, I want to also mention that this is a pretty basic introductory. It's a primer for budgeting. So if you're already doing your own accounting, payroll, and budgeting, maybe this is a refresher for you, and that's great. You're welcome. But this is really meant to just sort of give some of the vocabulary that you might hear over and over. When I began a nonprofit over a decade or so ago, before I joined the South Arts team. And some of these terms were not completely new to me, but I didn't have a really good grasp on exactly what they meant. And so this is why I started building these learning programs, was to help other professionals really in their journey. So we weren't all reinventing the wheel or having to take expensive classes in order to catch up where we needed to be professionally. And everyone is capable of doing budgeting. I was not a math whiz in school. I did okay in geometry. I did fine. Was not a horrible student, but by no means did I ever think I want to go into accounting. However, I did manage a budget for a $500,000 organization, and now I oversee budgets of $6 million or more. So, this is something that we can all do. My undergraduate degree is in theater. I have a master's in library media. So again, I'm just letting you know, none of that spells out math. So you don't have to be a math whiz to do budgeting. We want to begin with this primer. Well, we're going to just really start at the start line. When we talk about a project budget, a lot of times people get stuck on, where do I start with this? And the truth is, you have a lot of that information already stored in your brain. So we'll pick that out for you. What goes into an expense budget? So we're going to workshop this together, and because of the large number of people who are attending this particular workshop, we won't break out into groups or do individual questions. Sort of as a whole, we'll go through and think through an exercise of where we need to put together an expense budget. And so when we think about, well, where do I use an expense budget? Think about grant writing, think about your own project needs, your own monitoring, but also if you're working with government, putting together an expense budget, say for like a request for proposal, is really important to have. You want to make sure that it's truthful, that it's clear and concise, and that it's complete. And so we'll talk about that as well. And then we want to talk a little bit more about budgeting more than just money, because there's things like cash flow that come up that can really just bite you later on if you're not thinking about when to budget, right? When you pay bills, and also when the money comes in so you can pay those bills. So how is this used in the real world? Well, if you're working on a contract with somebody, you might want to spell out exactly where and when in that agreement certain payments happen, so you can track that and know when to pay, say, like your artist assistants, or pay vendors or other people who may be contracting with you on a particular project. The other place that you would need that is, say you want to go to the bank and purchase a building or do a loan. That's kind of advanced, but a cash flow statement is really important. And in fact, some funders, I know once upon a time, and I don't know if they still do, the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta, for example, ask for a cash flow statement. And we'll talk a little bit about that. There's some great templates out there, but again, it simply just means monitoring cash coming in and cash going out. And that's really important to the sustainability and the viability of your work as an artist. In fact, most businesses, big and small, one of the reasons that they don't continue to succeed is because of cash flow issues. So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to get into some basic accounting terms. You've probably heard some of these terms. We'll talk about what they mean and what context they come up in. And then we'll talk about other budgeting considerations, like how much do I pay myself? How much do I pay my organization? And so we'll talk a little bit about some guidelines around that as well. All right, so if I may, I know that there's some folks already in the Q&A asking questions. Just some basic things. Yes, we are recording this. This recording will be available later on our website. If there are really specific questions about your particular business or situation, I'll do my best at the end to answer those. But let's wait until the end to get through the Q&A, because we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to make sure we get through all of that and then have a robust conversation. Great, let's get started. Oh, there's my disclaimer. I already did it for you. So just reiterating, not a CPA, not an attorney. So before we get started, I just want to put a couple of things in your head, and so you can empower yourself to feel confident about budgeting. A budget is simply a tool, right? It's a tool that you use within your business to monitor your financial situation. It's not meant to be something that can't be adjusted. It's not meant to be something that where you have concessions or you need to make adjustments. It's a tool for you to use. And nothing is going to pigeonhole you into a budget once it's written. You may have to make adjustments, and you may have to think about other things that you didn't anticipate before. One thing I do tell people to do is really start with your income. How much income do you expect from a project? And then work backwards from there to fit in those expenses. Because if you start with the expenses, what you may end up with is telling yourself, well, now I have to sell X amount of pieces in order to make up these expenses. And if you're just starting out a new business, that might not be practical. Expenses are numerical expressions of all your hopes and dreams. I know that sounds corny. I get it. I was in a budgeting meeting with a CPA once upon a time years ago with a different organization, and he was a CPA and our board treasurer, and he got so excited about actually doing the budgeting process. And I asked him, I said, well, you were so excited about this. And he said, well, all of these expenses are things that we get to spend. We get to spend in an effort to support our mission. You get to spend money to support your artistic vision, to support your artistic dreams. So when you look at those expenses, think of those expenses as a way to connect to your mission and your goals as a professional. And then the other part of it is, what are your goals? And I don't mean this just sort of like, what are your professional artistic goals, or how many pieces of artwork do you want to sell in a year? But what are, your long-term vision? What are your family, material, spiritual goals? Think about those, really sit down and really assess what it is that you want. And none of it is wrong, right? If it's because you want to travel the world, then that's great. If it's because you want to be able to afford a mortgage, then that is also true and real. Definitely experience that. But the question is really, how can a budget support your goals? Oftentimes we think about like our business work over here and our personal life over here. And a lot of times we sort of miss how they connect. But really thinking about how your business and how your particular financial goals also support these other goals in your life will give you a little bit more. It'll make the budgeting process seem less daunting and work for you instead of against you. Hopefully that makes sense. This is just sort of a question for you, and this is personal. So if you feel, if you feel like you want to answer, please in the chat, think about what does it mean to be financially stable, and just drop that in the chat. Let's kind of read through a couple of those. I will tell you, for me, financially stable definitely means being able to afford the things in my life that require living, right? A roof over my head, food on the table, clothes. When my kids were living with me, they're both adults now, but those kinds of things, being able to pretty much offer that sort of middle class existence. That was where financial stability came in for me. And it also means to be able to save money, to be able to not feel stressed, or not to have a conference call with my husband because we need to spend $50 on something that we didn't plan. Believe me, I've been in those situations and know what that's like. And getting out of that and having that financial freedom feels amazing. Some people are saying protection, run their nonprofit and help people learn to read and understand music while making enough money to live comfortably. That's beautiful. Following a budget and saving, afford feeling safe, good food, and staying healthy, to be able to pay all your bills and have some money stored for future projects and emergencies, both nonprofit and for profit. Having the money I need to do the things that I want, to be able to cover unexpected expenses. Yes. Savings. Yes. Not having to worry about money. Hey, it would be great if everything could just be auto drafted and you don't have a care in the world, right? Time considerations, thinking about when to pay vendors. Oh, that was just a previous comment. Thank you for that. Having expendable income on emergencies, necessities, feeling financially resourced to cover my living expenses, support my, these are all really great. Liabilities, debts, resources. So, what I don't see in this is I want to be a millionaire, or excuse me, or I want to, fly in a private jet. That's okay too. No judgment here. but these are all very practical reasons, and for wanting to be financially stable, right? And the hope is that we can get more than just stable, that you have some sort of cushion. And that's hard. And I know this isn't like this is how you're going to get rich in 30 days kind of, webinar or workshop, because I get it. Like as an artist, sometimes the money comes in fits and spurts, or you sacrifice getting paid because you're passionate about a project. But we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So thank you all for sharing those. I really appreciate that. So really thinking about how we get started. I know this is going to sound pretty basic, but like, let's get started with what we know, right? If we're given a project, more than likely a project that's going to attract us is something that we're already doing, right? So if it's public art, like if it's a public art mural, you're likely going to have an interest in that or have some sort of knowledge, whether it's firsthand or tertiary knowledge of that experience. If you're putting on a production or a play or doing a music festival, you probably have some sort of sense of what that takes and all the different components that go into it. So start there when you think about your expenses. Start listing out like what you know and what you think the cost will be, and start there, right? The rest of it is really just research to fill in the gaps. What's really great about the internet is you can look up the price for anything. The internet is happy to sell you everything. So you can look up, different kinds of materials. You can look up pay. I'm going to mention this site again, but I want to go ahead and mention it now while it's on my mind, and that's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's bls.gov. And one way that you can use this particular resource is that it gives the mean average of salary by hour and by annual, um, for a lot of different jobs. And I think what's unique about the arts is sometimes the jobs don't always fit because we're really, wearing many hats as artists, but it'll give you a good indicator of what that mean average is by state and national. And I think that's a good benchmark. It's a good justification to start on what to pay people and what to pay yourself. So that's where some research might be helpful. Other kinds of research may just be really informal. I found that in starting a nonprofit, people were really helpful with sending me their budgets. And here's the thing about running a nonprofit anyway, is if you apply for a grant, then a lot of times, if it's a public grant, then that is public information. And so maybe even contacting some of your local state agencies or local arts agencies and asking them for examples of types of budgets that may fit with what you're thinking about, so you can get a good example. That, as human beings, one of the things that we do is we learn by imitation. We learn by doing, and that's a great way to do that, is to share information together. If you're not a nonprofit and you're another business, take somebody out for coffee, get that information and start filling in the gaps on what it is that you need. And then step 3, what is that timeline, right? So not only do you know that, let's say over 6 months on this project, you're going to have to spend X amount of money, but you also need to know when you're going to spend this particular amount of money, right? So is it the first quarter of the year, the second quarter of the year? If you're waiting on a particular check or grant or other kind of payment from someone, and you've got a year to do a project, but it's going to take them 2 to 3 months to get you that money, do you have enough money to start the project while you're waiting on that money to come in? Those are some considerations to think about. We hear that adage, sometimes it takes money to make money. And in this instance, it's kind of true. I think that puts a lot of people at a disadvantage. But in the course of a grant cycle, for example, or a payment cycle, you may be waiting on that money to come in while your expenses are piling up. And if you can get ahead of that and sort of work things out with your partners and with the people who are hiring you to make sure that you're not coming out of your own pocket, that's the best case scenario. So what is the timeline is really important. And then step 4 is who is involved. Who are your business partners, assistants? If it's a public event, do you have to pay the security? Are public, members of the public part of this process as well? And we'll talk more about that. But all of these different aspects of who is involved have different implications for how you put together your budget and what expense items you will need to be covering. I'm going to stop right there because I know I'm going kind of fast, and I want to just check in with this Q&A real quick. So Jordan asks, what approaches would you recommend for budgeting for expanding your staff? It's a great question. I think this is really part of your planning. So, you may have to grow your staff incrementally as a startup. So some of this may be, I need to start with a part-time staff member and then grow that position into a full-time position, right? So that means that you may start at one rate, and then when you're doing your planning for the next year, increase that. I think that's a really good business plan goal, to think about how you're going to scale up a business. The other thing to think about is, when you can give, for a private business, bonuses or raises or things like that to also shore up people's income as you move through the year. But I think that, the big piece of that is really that planning stage. And it requires some flexibility in the very beginning. And you may have a partner or somebody who is willing to come on part time and then move into full time. I wouldn't promise anybody that because you can get into a sticky situation there. But again, growing that incrementally from part time to three, you know, to 3/4 to now the full year is something that I would look at doing. When writing to apply for an RFP, is it appropriate to ask for more specific details that the RFP needs addressed? It really depends on who's issuing that request for proposal. You can always ask questions up to a certain period of time for a lot of RFPs, but government RFPs, for example, may have a question period, and after that period, they cannot answer any more questions for you, right? Because we cannot give away the appearance of favoritism. So yes, ask all the questions you want. I submitted a proposal for a county project a couple of years ago, before I was with South Arts, and one of the things we went back and forth on were their insurance requirements. They required a tremendous amount of insurance that was not applicable to me. But what you have to understand that it was probably lawyer boilerplate, right? This was something that they asked of everybody. And so when I went back to the manager of that particular project, I went and said, hey, I don't need cyber liability or insurance for drivers. Those are things that didn't really apply to that particular project. And so I was able to go back to the insurance broker, take those things out and reduce my insurance for that, right? So there are ways to have those conversations. The other thing to think about though with government grants is that if it's a grant that's been approved by an elected body, then it might be almost near impossible to change the amount that's available for you. There are some wiggle room areas, but just also remember that if it's gone through a legislative process, that might be very difficult to do. Great questions. So I wanted to just, in starting with the budget, I know you can't see this, but this is a budget template, and I bring it up because I'm going to send it all to you. It has the formulas in it for adding, and it probably has a lot of things that many of you will never need. But it's helpful to look at these kinds of templates to say, oh, I didn't think about payroll tax. I didn't think about, my insurance or my personal taxes. So those are things to really just sort of jog your memory a little bit, so you can start planning a budget. So I will send this to you all. It's a template that is pretty standard in a lot of government. This is a 2-year template. I think it asks, for actuals and projected, but you can use it however you want to. And I think that it's just it's something I did, is look for budget templates when I first started budgeting, especially ones that already had formulas in it. I'm a little better with Excel now, but I know it's not always native to most of us as we continue through our art careers. So I want to kind of go through an example real quick of a temporary public art project. And in the chat, and again, use your imagination here. There's a picture of a mural, and that's sort of the default that we go to when we think about public art, right? But public art could be sculptures, it could be a live jazz performance, it could be an outdoor installation, it could be an outdoor theater production like Shakespeare in the Park. So think about, this project, and in the chat, put in what you think some of the material costs may be. So this is just a quick brain popcorning. Insurance, yes. Supplies, definitely. Scaffolding, bucket rental, yes. So some people have, again, starting with what they know. Paint, labor, vendors, artists, insurance, parking attendants. You guys are great. Rentals, sound systems, stage, tables, chairs, transportation. That's a great one. Um, labor permits. You guys are awesome. Yeah, all of these are great. And please don't feel overwhelmed by the amount of expenses, but these are all great. Digital PR, box office fees, that's great. Yeah. How much you're going to have to kick back to people? Or if you're even selling online, how much of that is going to be a credit card fee? All of those are expenses that you need to list so they don't pop out at you. And I'm going to save this chat and send it to you as well. That way you just sort of have a running list of things to think about in addition to that budget template. Per diem, yes, or per diem being like if you have artists visiting, you want to offer money for their travel, for their food each day. So come up with a standard for that. Flight, taxis, Uber. Um, someone, Vanessa asked about sharing the Google Drive link. You know what, I didn't share it in Google Drive. I originally meant to, but I will send that out to you all. So just email me if you didn't get the welcome email that was sent yesterday evening, and I will make sure to get that to you. But I will send it out to everyone who registered that I have an email for. Yeah, I mean, oh wow, someone said NYC Fashion Week taxi expenses killed their budget. Yeah, I mean, those things really add up, and really getting ahead of that and thinking that, and again, sometimes things are unexpected, right? I mean, when we had that, do you all remember a couple of years ago during the pandemic, we had a lot of issues with shipping, and therefore, like lumber was really crazy. My brother-in-law actually and his wife were building a house at the time, and they had to stop construction because they couldn't afford the lumber. The original estimate was way off. So, what are those contingency plans too? When something happens, do you have that emergency fund? And here's the reality of the thing: most Americans don't have $1,000 in savings. Like we just don't have cash on hand because of expenses right now. We are sort of a debt-led society, and so again, I'm not saying all this to be preachy or to be, sanctimonious. This is the reality, right? That, but I think again, the more you get into these exercises and thinking about something like a cost overrun, so if you can put that into your own personal budget, assuming that all of the expenses are sort of going to stay the same, plus putting in a line item that is a 20%, 15 to 20% overrun, right? And that means that if you have expenses, you have a little bit of a buffer there. And what you can do with that expense, and you can do this with savings as well, right? Your savings is an expense line item. It doesn't, now, when you're applying for grants, you may want to take that out because they won't pay for your savings. But in your own personal budgets, your own operational budgets, if you're putting money into a reserve fund or you're putting money into a cost overrun fund, that's an expense. Take that out regularly and put that aside and just go ahead and make it as automatic as paying a utility or any other monthly bill. And then that way you can start snowballing some of that money and some of that cash for emergencies. So, you guys did great on that, by the way. Really great on sharing what you know about what might go into public art. So, again, temporary public art. Thinking about this as just an example, and I know we have all different disciplines here, but again, who is involved? Remember that question. We have the artist fee. Many of you mentioned that. Please pay yourself. We'll talk more about that. An assistant fee, if the public is involved, many of you said permits, security, insurance, perfect. You're already thinking ahead. Income tax for your personal budget. And this is something that I'm having a conversation with my youngest daughter, who is about to graduate college and go into a job where they're paying her as a contractor. And so I keep saying, you got to put aside that 30%, because as a self-employed individual, you're going to be paying income tax plus self-employment tax. And that typically runs around the 25 to 30% range. If it's less, great. You've saved that money, but if you're paid $1,000 for a job, you're going to want to put aside 300. Believe me, as someone who's done independent contract work, it'll really sting at the end if you decide to just do it on your annual taxes, and you'll see that tax liability little calculator on TurboTax go way up, and that's never any fun. Marketing. Someone had said marketing earlier, digital. So things like Facebook ads, Instagram ads. Like, how are people going to know about what it is that you're doing? You may be able to negotiate that with someone who's hiring you, or if you have a producing, presenting entity. If you're doing theater or music, they may cover that cost, but they may not. So you want to make sure you understand what the marketing costs are going to be. Rental equipment. These are just a few of the items. You guys listed a lot more, and then on that template that I'm going to send you are other considerations as well. Again, we're not just budgeting money. So I did a little example here of what you may see sometimes called a development plan. A lot of times in the nonprofit world, we refer to development as the department that raises money, right? That gets the grants and donations and so forth. This is not that. This development plan is really about different areas of running a business and combining them together in one plan. So let's kind of talk through this real quick. So we're going to pretend that this particular development plan is about offering a class, right? Very simple, similar to what you're showing up here for today, just a class, and I'm going to charge for this class. So here's my program right up here. We have class of happening in March. It's going to happen on the 3rd of March in 2024. So in January, I have some work to do before I hit March, right? Because I got to get people to this class and I need to get money coming in. So I might do a press release in January. I might do my first MailChimp announcement. And for those of you who are not familiar with MailChimp, it's a email service similar to some others that exist out there where you can, email people en masse. So that's going to be one of the projects that I have to do. I'm going to pay $100 for postcards because I don't have a ton of money. I'm going to use one of those postcard services online, right? So I need to make sure that I get the postcards into the printer online in time for them to get that back to me so I can put those up in art centers or even mail them the old school way. But I may just want some kind of printed material that I can hand out to people, put in coffee shops, those kinds of things. So I'm going to build a sign up form. I got to have a way for people to know about the class. So I got my press release and I have to have a place to direct them to, right? So I'm going to do my sign up form, and that can be a Google form, that can be through Squarespace, your website domain, there's so many different kinds of things that we have now. If it's a free event, you may be using Facebook. But nonetheless, you're going to want to put that up in plenty of time for people to pre-register. It also, when we talk about cash flow, starting to collect those fees now might help you front the money to pay for those postcards, to pay for those stamps, to pay for those other things that you'll need. So you'll see here in February, we're going to do an IG campaign, an Instagram campaign, right? So we may need a little bit of money for that if we want to boost it, if we want to get it out to more people. We're going to send our postcards out 2 weeks ahead of time. That's a good saturation time for people. It'll also give enough time for the post office to let you know which ones are undeliverable, hopefully. We're going to need some money for stamps, approximately $300. And then we're going to just, in terms of our operations, we're going to want to review our lesson plan, right? This is a class. We want to make sure that we're prepared. That's part of our business too. So we need to make sure that these other things are taken care of. So we have the bandwidth and the time to really focus on sort of the meat of the work, right? Because as an artist, or art maker, arts organization, not only are you handling all of these other things like marketing and financials, but you've got the actual work to do, right? So we want to make sure that we're budgeting that in as well. So again, in this final month, we're printing out all of our class materials. We're gonna put online class materials for people to access. And so this is sort of the final like nuts and bolts, and where you get down to sort of the minutia and the details, because you've taken care of all these things. I hope this makes sense. This is something that's really helpful to do. This is taken from a spreadsheet. Now we have Trello, we have what are the other ones that are out there that y'all know about? Like all the different kinds of you know uh, programs that you can use to help. Honestly, for me, some of those in the very beginning, because I was only really the sole collaborator, weren't as helpful as just a spreadsheet. Or you could start with the spreadsheet and move those to those different tasks. It's really a personal preference. Honestly, people like things a lot more visual. I tend to be a visual learner, except for when it comes to planning. I am old school, will write things down in a book, or just use a simple spreadsheet. So again, I mentioned that because it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It just has to be useful. So this is mapping out our actions. Each column is a week or a month, and rows are divided into categories. And that's, again, sort of a simple format there. So I want to stop and just kind of go, I'm going to go back to the other slide because that one is a lot. But I want to go through these questions. So someone said, you've mentioned a couple of different versions of the same budget, the proposal budget, the operating budget, personal budget. Can you give an example of a project and the various different budget versions that should be associated with it? Similarly, can you give an overview of the different budgets we should keep and how they all talk to each other? For example, our project budgets, LLC budget, personal finances, that for all of their practice and stuff. So that's a great question, and you're right. And sometimes we use these things interchangeably, for better or for worse. And so what we're talking about with the project budget, typically it's almost like, for those of you who have a full operating budget, a project budget is like a cross section of that, right? So you may have many different things happening, but we're going to pull out and focus on this one project, right? So let's say, for example, you're a theater company and you're doing Shakespeare in the Park. This is the one thing that we're going to focus on. What does that one project cost? Now you're going to have other costs, right, with your other things that you're doing. You may have other shows happening. You may be doing, on August Wilson play series, in addition to Shakespeare in the Park, you may be doing a poetry reading night. You may be doing a fundraiser. Those are things that are part of an overall annual budget, your full operating budget. The project budget is going to hone in on just a cross section of that. The reason I'm focusing on project budgets within this and not going through the whole operation budget is, one, we just get into a lot more detail that we don't have time to cover. But if you want us to cover that in the future, then maybe that's something that we can bring in somebody to talk about. But the reason I'm focusing on this project budget is because for a lot of grants right now, they're not necessarily going to be giving you that full general operating support, right? Particularly for solo artists and for small arts organizations. a lot of times eligibility requirements keep you from going after those bigger pools of money in the very beginning, unfortunately. So what you're faced with is a lot of times funding project by project and sort of piecemealing it together. And so you want to, as you put together your full budget, start with the different projects that you're going to be doing, within a year, and then compile them into one bigger budget that is your overall operating budget. And in that operating budget are going to be, and we're going to cover this, indirect expenses. So we'll talk more about that later, because again, that's terminology that you'll see pop up. Does that make sense? That I'd answer your question? I would say for personal budgets, there was a question about personal budget. I keep a household budget. I don't really, I'm not really operating it much right now these days, as I'm working at South Arts and also finishing up a master's program. I have a side consulting business that I haven't really been doing much of with, but in the past years I have. And so that particular LLC does have its own budget. And so that really sort of talks to my household budget, right? So my business budget is not going to include things like my mortgage or utilities directly, but my household budget that I do with my husband is a separate budget just for my own household. And the way that it talks to the other budgets is the income that I'm expected in my LLC budget is going to directly affect my household budget. Does that make sense? For the person who answered that question, you're welcome to come off mic.
Yeah, that was me. Thank you so much. That's super
Yeah,
helpful.
I know it can be confusing. And there's a lot of different kinds of budgets, and I'm not trying to overcomplicate this all for you, but you definitely, even for the purposes of being a sole proprietor and having an LLC, it actually behooves you to have that LLC budget and your own personal budget. So you're demonstrating, should you ever need to the IRS, that they're completely separate things. Now, I'm not going to get too far into this because, again, I'm not a CPA, and we will have an actual CPA in a few weeks join us to talk about taxes. So those are some great questions to hold on to, and come back to ask a certified accountant. So thank you for that great question. Will this time budget example be available after the workshop? All of this material will be available, and I'll send you the budget template as well. So anything you need, plus the chat, plus this recording, will all be available to you. So, so I hope that those answered those questions. So we're going to keep moving on. Thank you all for the great questions and participation. So cash flow. I love and hate this little GIF right here, or GIF, if that's your preference. We talked about cash flow, and again, this is simply monitoring the cash coming in and leaving your account, right? So some of the banks now, with the different kinds of applications that they offer, are starting to look at snapshots of cash flow on personal accounts. So it might be something just to look at to kind of get an idea of what they consider cash flow. That's just sort of a tip and FYI. I've noticed that I get that little thing on my, I use Truist, and it's on my app. It'll tell me how much money is typically coming in. So it's sort of tracking that over time. But for cash flow, we want to think about, well, has a payment date been determined? A lot of you that are working as contractors, and even those organizations that have contracts, we want to think about, like, when the money is coming, right? As someone who pays out on grants, I have a lot of grantees towards the payment date ask me, hey, when is that money coming again? Because they're probably, what they're trying to do is get a sense of what they can pay, what they can invest in, what kind of programming they can do. So it's important to know, one simple way of doing this is sort of look at, January through December, and say, in January, I expect this much money. This is how much money I expect to spend, right? and then sort of looking at there might be months where you're negative cash flow. You have more money going out than you have coming in. That's not a bad thing, not unless it is continuous, right? A lot of businesses, if you were opening a restaurant today, it would probably take you 3 to 5 years to be solvent. And what that means is for your expenses to equal the income, the money coming in. It's not an unusual thing for a bank to look at, but outside of that, for you, for a lot of us, for our purposes here, it's really about when can I pay myself and when can I pay other people. And so you want to think through that, right? If you are using something like a third party payment system that's a merchant, how long does it take for that money to go into that merchant to hit your bank, right? And then, so, if you're telling somebody, oh, yeah, I'll pay you tomorrow, that might not be the best promise, right? If you're working with government, it could take a couple of months. I've had projects be delayed, project payments be delayed by months and months and months before from a government project. And so I have to figure out in the meantime, now how am I going to pay, the person who's working with me? So maybe what that means is I pay them first and then have to pay myself a larger chunk of money when that comes in. This is where it can get kind of tricky for people. This is where, even as a small business, going to a bank and getting like a small business loan might be something to consider if you're working on bigger projects. For a lot of us starting out, that is likely not on the table. So you're just going to have to really kind of think about when things are coming in, when they're going out, and try your best to project when you have those low months. So if you know in the summertime that you're not going to have as much cash because people aren't doing a lot of projects, people are on vacation, whatever it is, then what can you do in the winter, spring leading up to the summer to make sure that you're saving money so that you can cover your expenses in the summer? Does that make sense? So, this is helpful for contracts. I have a colleague, Jim Grace, who's an attorney, who will say negotiate to the contract, not from the contract, right? So when we're negotiating to a contract, we want to think about those payment dates. We want to say, what is really realistic for me to pay my collaborators? What timeline? Is it 30 days from, the end of a project? Is it 15 days? Do I pay them in increments? Do I pay myself in increments? When are things due? When can you float things and when can you not float things? For example, your cell phone, if you don't pay Verizon, they'll shut your phone off. So those are things to really consider as you even think about contractual agreements with folks. And this is how that budget, that numerical piece starts making more sense as it connects to the other things that you are doing every day in your business. So I'm going to go over some vocabulary, and this is really the last of it, and then we can kind of get into some Q&A. But these are some, stepping outside of the project budget piece, these are really applicable across the board to a lot of different types of business entities. So we're going to start with variable costs. So a variable cost is a cost that varies depending on what is being used or consumed. For example, paint. A larger mural or canvas is going to require more paint. Certain outdoor projects that are using paint might require a certain type of paint, one that has a protection against the sun, a paint that's anti-graffiti. Those kinds of things are going to cost significantly more based on the project that you're doing. It varies again based on that project. I usually think, and this is not 100% across the board, but a lot of times I think about those variable costs as consumable costs, like your paint, your lumber, maybe even scaffolding for a particular project, rentals, those things, they kind of depend on what project you're doing. If you're doing you know, a show that's in a black box theater that has a minimal set, that's going to be a different type of expense than doing a very large production with a 30-person cast, right? Your fixed cost, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, right? Your fixed costs remain the same whether the production increases or decreases, right? So you're going to pay your lighting bill, you know, your utility bill every month. It may go up and down based on sort of how much wattage you used, but it's still considered a fixed cost, right? So no matter what it is that you do, these fixed costs are going to remain. This could include insurance, your studio rental, your office rental, your utilities, your phone bill, your payroll for, you know, employees. Those are costs that are going to remain the same typically throughout the year, right? Direct project costs. These are all costs directly associated with a specific project, right? So not all of your salary is going to go towards one project. Not all of your utilities are going to go towards one project. A percentage of those will, right? Those are your indirect costs for a project, or actually, I'm sorry, those are your direct costs for a project. Um, but again, that those direct project costs are associated with a specific project. If you're applying for something, say with the National Endowment for the Arts, typically it's project based, and so it's going to ask you a series of budget questions where you might allocate a percentage of the salary of your staff towards that specific project, but not all of the salary. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So more terms. General operating, this covers costs to keep the business running. It can't be easily allocated to a specific project or programming. If it's unrestricted, like an unrestricted grant, it can be used at the discretion of the organization. That is what we want. That is the gold standard, right? As arts organizations, we want that unrestricted funding. Even as artists, unrestricted funding would be amazing to have someone hand you a pile of money and say, use it how you best see fit. Because chances are we're going to use it as we see fit for the and research supports that people make good decisions based on what they need. Unfortunately, in this field, and a lot of times we have to apply project by project rather than getting general operating that is unrestricted. Again, projects, these are funds that are earmarked for a particular activity or outcome, right? So that's the difference. Your general operating is usually like an annual budget. It's the whole kit and caboodle of everything that you have to pay, whereas your project is like a cross section or a slice of that pie that you're focusing on when you do those numbers. Excuse me, I'm going to drink a little bit of water. So some more terms for you. Direct. These are activities or services that benefit specific projects or programs. They directly relate, right? We've talked a little bit about this already, but they're project staff, consultants, supplies, marketing materials, travel. Indirect benefit more than one type of project or program. These may be utilities, rent, administrative staff, or equipment. This is where it gets kind of tricky because a percentage of those indirect may actually be direct costs. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. You may hear the terms earned revenue. What does that mean? What does it mean to have earned revenue? Well, those are tickets, sales of artwork. Those are things where you sell a thing and people give you money for it, right? So that is earned revenue. That could also be consulting It could be teaching classes, it could be a lot of different things, but typically there's an exchange of money for the service or product that you're providing. Contributed. These are grants and donations. So you'll hear, well, what is the contributed income, right? So these are donations given without condition, in-kind gifts. So this may be space, equipment, supplies, grants. They may have conditions, but they're not quid pro quo. So again, because it's contributed, there's a condition that it might fund a very specific project, but you're not obligated to say do a service or project specifically for the person who's giving you the grant. That would be a fee for service. That would be earned revenue, right? So we want to think about contributed grants and donations as not having a quid pro quo, right? I'm not giving you a thing and you're giving me something of equal value. Now, the value for sponsorship and others a lot of times comes in, their corporate mission, so Delta may, sponsor a theater series because it's part of their corporate giving strategy, but it also puts eyes on their brand, right? It builds goodwill in the community, and so that is what they're getting out of it. They're not getting a play that is specifically produced for Delta, right? Check on my time here. Pretty good. So we talked about that. So this is the part I want to get into before we sort of get into our Q&A and discussion. But these are some other considerations. I, in my last line of work, I sort of did what my colleague Emmett, who's on this call, does, and that was really work directly with artists, and that was a lot of the work that I did. And so a lot of that really became about helping artists and other people who work with artists understand the value of what it is that they're doing. So one thing that I have seen in reviewing grants that artists have submitted is, there's a real passion and commitment to the work, but unfortunately a line item is missing where they're paying themselves a fee, right? And so that becomes problematic because to me, it doesn't seem sustainable for that particular person and it's not fair, right? And so one of the things as I'm speaking to artists now, I'll speak to organizations in a second. I want to encourage you to always pay yourself, make that a line item, your artist fee, your artist lead fee. Many of you probably know this, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I think it's something that I like to reiterate because this conversation I also have with other people who work with artists. So what does that look like? What am I actually paying myself? So I will tell you that there's no real hard and fast standard for that. Some of it can be hourly, some of that, like if you were working on a large scale mural, might be by square foot. There's certain standards that you can look up and research, but typically what I do as when I do contract work is I look at the overall expenses, right? Like we did before, add them all up, and then 20% of those expenses is my fee, right? So for example, I'm going to use the number $10,000 because it's a nice number to divide by. It's easy to understand multiples of 10. So $10,000, 20% of that would be $2,000. $2,000 is going to be my payment, and my total budget will be $12,000. Does that make sense? So I want to make sure that between that 15 and 20%, that is what I'm paying myself. That does not include what I'm paying other people. It does not include what I'm paying other vendors, what I'm paying for insurance, what I'm paying for other kinds of expenses that we listed earlier. Now, someone asked that great question about how the budgets speak to each other. If I'm taking that $2,000 In my own personal budget, what I'm going to say is when they pay me that $2,000, I'm immediately going to take 30% of that and put it into a savings or pay taxes on it. You can set up a lot of states now, I don't know about all of the states, but a lot of them do have a way to pay your taxes online now, instead of having to write out a check, and you can get reminders and so forth. But that would be how those two budgets sort of talk to each other. So hopefully that makes sense. Others may have different a different view on how, what you pay yourself, but I like to say that 15 to 20% is sort of a standard that I have come to know. Um, you know, Different kinds of grants may have restrictions on that, and this is where saying no can be a powerful moment in your life, because if you're looking at, say, a 6-month project but you're only going to be paid like $1,000, is it worth it to take that project? What are the things that you're using? Do you have a decision tree, for example, on how you take certain projects? Is it because of the pay? Is it because of the prestige? Or is it because you get to work with certain people that you've been dreaming of working with? Those are some really good reasons, to accept work. If it's not going to pay your bills and you're going to end up coming out of pocket for that, that might be a time where you think, you know what, I'm not going to take this opportunity because it's going to end up costing me more than it's going to give back. So, what is your cut as an organization? I am going to use sort of the standard of a lot of what have seen in government grants, and some private grants. Again, sometimes that's 20% in terms of administrative overhead, but that also is in addition to the direct salary, right? So let's say, for example, I'm filling out a project grant for the National Endowment for the Arts, which I've done in the past. And so if I'm looking at that grant, then it's going to ask me about the direct cost. Remember that term, the direct expenses. So let's say that it takes 3 staff members to work on that one particular project. Maybe we have a staff of 5, but 3 of them really are working on it. And so I take that salary, and let's say that this project takes, 4 months to do, right? So I take a percentage of that salary, that I think they're going to be spending their time on. Maybe it's going to take, our marketing person 15% of their time to work on this grant, right? Maybe it's going to take our executive director 30% of their time, and maybe it's going to take our program director, more like 40% of their time. So I take that 15, that 30, and that 40% time, and so 40%, say, times the program director's salary, and that's the number I put in that line item. Does that make sense? So let's say, again, using easy numbers here. So say I get paid $20,000, not a lot of money, I know, but say I get paid $20,000, and I'm going to be working on this, you know, 25% of my time. So that's, if you took a calculator and you said 20,000 times 0.25 times 25%, that's $5,000. So for that line item, for my position at $20,000 is $5,000, right? That's how much I'm directly going to be putting my time, and the organization is going to directly be paying for that project for my time. Does that make sense? So I'm going to go over that again real quick. So I'm filling out a grant, and it's going to ask me what is it that I am paying, or what are the expenses for the people who are working on this project, right? So it's 3 staff members. One of them is the marketing director, one of them is the executive director, and one of them is a program director. Each of those positions probably have different salaries. Your executive director probably makes more. They may not be spending a greater percentage of their time on it, but their salary is greater, right? So you don't want to just sort of throw out the numbers in there and sort of guess. You want to say how much time is each position spending on this specific project times their annual salary, right? So it might be 15% times their annual salary, it might be 25% times their annual salary, and it might be 40% times their annual salary. That's the salary expense. You'll put each one of those in a line item, and then the total will be the salary expense that is going directly to that project. And then there might be in other grants, particularly private grants, a lot of times they'll give you an allowance and allow you to add in another 15 to 20% on top of that for indirect costs for administration. Because here's the thing, at the end of the day, even if you piecemeal together all of these different projects, but nobody has paid for your overhead, then that can really put a nonprofit in a precarious position. All of these things matter. And so just making sure that we're tracking them, that we understand them, empowers us and empowers you to make sure that you're asking for what your worth is. We know that the data suggests that larger organizations value their staff time more in grant applications than smaller organizations do. So just be really realistic about that percentage of time when a project budget comes up that you're going to have to spend on it. I once looked at a budget, a grant opportunity with a county, and it was for a health initiative. And with this past organization, we did a lot of health initiatives. And so I thought about applying for it. But when I read the fine print, the grant was only going to cover 3% of all costs, no staff time, no overhead, just 3%. That was going to be it. I couldn't produce the kind of work that needed to be done with just 3% of the budget, right? So that was an opportunity I said pass on. So, again, going back to that idea that this is a tool, this is something that helps you make decisions, whether that's a yes, I will take this job, or a no, I cannot afford to take this job. That is what a budget can do for you. So I want to give you some tips before we move on to some questions. I'm going to reiterate that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS.gov, has wage information. This kind of gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what the mean average is by state and what the mean average is by national based on your job description, right? It may not be a perfect fit, but at least it gives you justifications. I have a mentor of mine who always says, offer multiple justifications for what you're asking, right? We make decisions based on emotion, we justify with facts. So justify your work with facts. Always pay thyself. Always pay yourself. Make sure that you can pay yourself as part of a project. If you are volunteering, but you want to be paid at some point in the future, I know I've been there, where you volunteer for several years and starting an organization, whether that's half full-time to part-time volunteering, just make sure that you are tracking what your true worth is. So I'll give you a real life example. In the second year that I ran an organization, I paid myself $100 a week. That's all I could pay myself, but I wanted to just start paying myself so the board could get used to that idea. And so when I showed them the board reports, I said, this is how much I'm getting paid. This is how much the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other information from Americans for the Arts or the NEA says that I'm actually worth, right? Let's build to that. So going back to Jordan's questions of scalability, we have got to scale to that to make it, to make sure that the organization can continue to exist. Same with artists. You have to be able to pay yourself. You're not doing anybody any favors in your professional career if you don't take payment, right? It won't last. You'll burn out and you'll give up. And that is not what we want you to do. We want you to continue to create, and we want you to continue to give your gifts to this world, right? Budget your time too. It's not just about how much you get paid, but when you get paid. You can get paid all the money in 1 month, use it all up, and then not have enough money for the rest of the year. Plan accordingly. The budget is the numerical expression, going back to this again, of your mission, your goals, your purpose, and your art, right? It's the same as if someone said, well, what do you do? And you write it out in a paragraph of here's what I do. I'm going to explain what my purpose is. The budget backs that up with numbers. They shouldn't be disconnected from one another, right? All that you want to do and all that you want to achieve is backed up by those numbers. It's just a numerical expression of the mission and your purpose and your artwork. So that's it. That's all. That's what I have. I know that that's a lot. We started sort of small, we started sort of basic, and then we got into some deeper questions. So I'm going to take a second here. And I may not be able to get through every single comment in the chat, but I do appreciate you. And if you have other questions, you have my email. I'm going to send this to you. And I'm going to make sure to follow up. This will be recorded. And I want to remind you all too that coming up in just a few weeks, and it's on our professional development page on the 25th, we will be welcoming Elaine Grogan Luttrell, who is a CPA who works with artists. She's amazing. She has a book. I don't get any kickbacks from this, but it's called Art and Numbers. It's basic without being condescending of a book, but it has some great examples in there of really explaining a lot of these concepts. And I honestly use it kind of like a guide, like when I go back and say, oh well, what do I need to really be thinking about in this term? What does that mean? I can go back and have a reference for it. So Art and Numbers, I think you can get it at any sort of book retailer. You could probably order it through an independent bookshop, but I know it's available on Amazon. I love Elaine. I think she does such a great job as well, and I hope you will all join us for that. So let me get over to our Q&A and see what people are thinking about. So Jordan asks, regarding resources, what would you recommend for grants and marketing insights? The only that I know of is the Foundation Center, now known as Candid. That's a good question. You're right. And it used to be really fortunate. I used to say in Atlanta, we had a foundation center here that we could go to. And in fact, a lot of the books I own in my sort of personal library, I bought from them when they shut down their physical space. But another one that you could, there's a lot of, for marketing, I would say, look at Beth's blog, Beth Cantor. She wrote a great book called The Networked Nonprofit. And it really talks about the decentralization of social media. Yes, Cantor, and I think it may be with a K, not a C, but pronounced the same way, Kanter. But she also has just a blog called Beth's Blog, and I was very fortunate that I got to spend some time with her in San Francisco going over a social media campaign that we were trying to do for different cities. And she's so just direct, but in that nice, like really sweet way, and really gets excited about social media, and is just such a great person. So I would recommend that for marketing. As far as like for grants, there's a lot of different kinds of grants and things like that, but I would say start with serving on a grant panel if you haven't done that. Jordan, I'm pretty sure you probably have. But if you haven't, yeah, I mean, continue to do that. All of you, I would encourage you at some point, you can work with your state arts agency or local arts agency, or even with South Arts. Think about reviewing grants and being on grant panels. It's a great way. My husband did this. He's an art teacher for a state in our region, and he was really just sort of surprised at how difficult it is to not only really encapsulate what it is that you want to say and ask for within a grant application, but how bad some grant applications were. So I would also say that at some point, I hope uh, that we can offer a grant writing class. But I don't know, Emmett, do you have any sort of additions to that?
No, I posted the link to the 2024 Artwork Archives resource
Mhm.
for possible funding opportunities. I know that exists. I think Jordan mentioned the new Foundation Center.
Mhm.
Is it called Candid now?
Candid, yeah.
That's a great resource. But beyond that, that's all I can think of right now.
Yeah. The other source that if you're looking to search grants is your local library. 100% of us pay for it, 20% of us use it. But think about your local library as well. They sometimes, not always, will, depending on where you are, will have access to different kinds of databases. So, I would think about going to your local library as well. We often forget about our libraries, and there's such a great resource, and always free. So look into that. Another one from Jordan: from a nonprofit or socially conscious for-profit perspective, what are some of the things grantors are looking for when you make reports on the money you were awarded beyond demographics and number of people? This really, again, I can't speak for all grantors. It may be different things. Again, sponsorships and grants are always different. Sponsorships a lot of times look for eyes on the brand. They are socially conscious, but they also want to make sure that that is something that their audience is aware of too. And they're also looking to reach demographics that could potentially be customers. For foundations or private giving, it's really more mission based. It's really more connection to that mission and connection to their funding priorities. So I would just make sure that whatever you're reporting connects to those funding priorities under what you were given the award for. So impact stories, it's always better when people give testimonials, as well. So those kinds of things, archiving them. And this is for everybody, attending an art event. Like, was it okay? Can you send out a survey? Can you follow up with people? That's just sort of basic customer service stuff. And so I think, that's one way to really think about it, is what that impact is. So and then going back to the original application that you applied for, and looking at the questions that they gave, and then saying, well, did you hit the goals that you said you were going to? Did you deliver on the promises that you made?
I think that's the key. That's kind of the key is did you deliver what you said you would, and how close were you on the budget? It don't have to be a perfect match to the budget, but you have to be pretty close. And if you have some very vast discrepancies, are you able to explain it?
Right, right. Um, so great. Someone said, can you review one more time? What would you pay yourself? I know you said 20%, but I did not catch everything you said. So yes. So when you add up the expense budget, make sure you want to add everything up. So say it's $10,000, right? That's all your expenses that you have, what you're paying your collaborators, what you're paying your vendors and everybody. And then a percentage of that is going to be 20%. So that's $2,000. So you add in $2,000. So your total project budget will be $12,000. So hopefully that answers your question. Hi, Barbara, how are you? She asked, can you type the name of the book? I did put that in the chat. But just to repeat, the networked nonprofit is Beth Cantor. Then she also has a follow-up book called Measuring the Network Nonprofit. So that gets into sort of how you measure impact. But I would start with the networked nonprofit. And then the other one, Art and Numbers, is Elaine Grogan Luttrell. And I also put that in the chat, and I'll send those to you as well in the follow-up. Emily, hi Emily. She says she is a grant manager, Georgia Council for the Arts. We're putting together a grant panel soon for their FY25 applications. If you're interested, send your name and a bio to evolin@gaarts.org. So thank you for that. Yes, Georgia Council for the Arts is one of those organizations that we love and are great partners with. And I would say that you should definitely, I'm going to copy this, Emily, if that's okay, and put it into the chat. So that way, when I send the chat notes out, everyone has it. You're welcome. Cool. So you'll see I put her note there in the chat, and so you can just shoot over your email if you want to be a part of that grant review process for Georgia Council for the Arts. Jordan says, last question, he promises. Sure. What are some of the best places to get fiscal sponsorship? You know, of VAE and the Arts Council for Greater Greensboro. Look at the field. They are actually offering a class very soon on fiscal sponsorship. I shared it on social media, but I'm not going to get into what fiscal sponsorship is. That's another, you go to the field and join that. But I would also look at, there's another Performance Art Network, PAN, Performance Arts Network. Am I getting that correct? They're located in New Orleans. I don't know if they have a national reach, but I believe the field may. So those are two that I think are doing some really good work in fiscal sponsorship. Yes, National Performance Network, NPN. Thank you very much. I was getting all my letters mixed up. But I know that they have a fiscal sponsorship. Alternate Roots does as well, but it's for their members. And I believe you have to be a member for 1 year before you take advantage of that particular service. So those are some to think about if you're looking at fiscal sponsorship. So what other questions? What other thoughts? We've got about 5 minutes left. So I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can just go and eat lunch. Great. Okay, so one more question here. Arts Accelerator asks, so it's 20% for the artists and 25% for the organization to add to the budget. So I would say, even for some organizations, it might be that administrative overhead is 20%, and that is an indirect cost, right? For organizations, there's also a percentage of salaries, of the employees who are going to work on the project. So I know this gets really confusing. So again, say I'm applying for a project, and then, I'm an organization, 3 employees are going to work on it. I'm going to look at the percentage of each employee, each of those 3 employees, times their salary, and that's going to go in that line item. For individuals, it's usually just sort of 20% overall, unless the project proposal or the request for proposal or the project that you're working on has a standard fee that they're paying, it might be a little bit different. Again, these are not sort of evergreen tactics to use on every single application or project that you come across, because some may have different parameters and different guidelines. But what if there's not one and you're negotiating what that fee should be? If I'm an individual freelancer, I'm going to ask for 20% of the expense budget, right? Of the overall expense budget. If I'm an organization, I'm going to ask for the percentage of time that my staff members have to dedicate to that particular project. And if they allow, right, say it's a grantor, if they allow, I'm going to ask between 15 and 20% of just overhead to pay for my things like my utilities, my rent, and all of that. If you think of it this way, you know, if you have to rent an office, for example, you know, you have to pay that rent every single month. And a certain percentage of that rent really is divided up for each project, right? So, as Elaine may talk about when she does the tax class, the IRS has a very similar formula when you are reporting this to your taxes. They take a percentage of what, like a home office may be. So all of these things are built into these percentages, how much time you spend on something. The reason I encourage you all to go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics is because if someone says, well, what's your hourly rate? At least you have something to start from. And I would say, again, it's a mean average. So you may be asking for more than that, but at least you have that benchmark to work from, right? Don't go below it. I hope that helps. I know that this can be kind of confusing. It's something that, like, when I was first doing this and starting an organization, it's like I would stare at a budget for hours and go, did I do this right? Like, what is happening here? It's so confusing. So all I can say is practice makes perfect. And again, I would encourage you to sit on those grant panels, get that real life like thing in your hands or on your screen that you can look at and just get an idea of what people are asking for and how they're asking. And look, if you're looking at artist grants, ask yourself, when you look at their budget, are they paying themselves? And sometimes people don't because they forget about that. So don't forget, pay yourself. If you don't take anything else away from this, take away, pay yourself, because that's really important. And I want everybody who is attending and our arts workers all across the Southeast to get the money for the value, because you're worth it. Someone says, in terms of paying ourselves on a project, we can get to afford the 20% for artist fee in the budget. What would you suggest as an hourly rate instead? So yes, that's a good question. I would again look at that Bureau of Labor Statistics thing and start from there. There's a lot of things that go into an hourly rate: years of experience, maybe even credential, and those kinds of things. But I think sort of looking at what that mean average is based on facts and data will give you that justification to feel comfortable to start from there and maybe even ask for more. So one last thing, Emmett, do you have anything to add to this? Anything coming up that you?
No, I would, I'm used to looking at budgets from an organizational perspective. And I will say this, as an arts organization or as artists, if I'm engaging other artists, I want to pay those artists. So if you're applying for arts grants, you want to make sure you're paying those artists. That's being socially responsible. So don't be afraid to ask for money to pay your artists. The thing you need to be hesitant about is administrative costs. And you need to cap that at no more than 30% of your budget. So by all means, pay your artists. Find out what market is and shoot for a little above market if you can. But pay your artists. That's what I will go out on.
Yeah, thank you, Emmett. So Emmett and I definitely share that same passion about paying artists and giving them the money that they deserve for the value that they offer our society. One of my proudest moments ever is early on starting an organization. I had a board member who was also a professional artist, and someone put out an RFP, and they weren't going to pay artists. It was this marketing campaign, and they just said, you know, great exposure, right? We've all seen that. Like, you'll get lots of exposure, no pay, yada yada yada. And my board member at the time wrote them back and copied me on it and said, and it was a very nice, very lovely, not inflammatory email, but just stated the facts of what artists have to pay for, what their credentials like, their years of experience, and then sort of just said, you know, asking artists to do this work for free is detrimental, you know, so forth and so on. And they ended up offering payment for that particular campaign. So, you know, advocate for yourselves. We will continue to advocate for you. But again, look at the research, look at that data, because it gives you those justifications and power to have those conversations about paying yourself what you're worth, whether you're an organization or an individual artist. So thank you everyone for joining us. We'll try to have this up recorded on the on our site within about 24 hours, and then I will send a follow-up email within about 24 hours. So have a good day, and I really appreciate you all being here and taking the time with us. There's going to be at the end a survey that pops up. Please fill that out. You also will give us an opportunity on the survey to tell us about other kinds of offerings you would like to see. And that helps us go and plan that for the next year. And so take that opportunity. It'll take about 4 minutes for you to do. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye. Happy New Year.